afternoon from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for this timely discussion. I am Margaret Jackson, the Deputy Director for Climate and Advanced Energy at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. Today, we will discuss grid reliability and resiliency amidst increasingly severe weather events like the one we saw in Texas last week. It seems like we just had a similar conversation at the end of last summer during the historic wildfire season in the Western United States and amidst the hurricanes that pummeled the Gulf Coast in rapid succession. We hope today will be a productive discussion to share lessons and identify solutions so that this doesn't happen again in another part of our country. As we're seeing, electricity is fundamental to human health and safety, as well as financial stability, and it's difficult to watch these policy and technology failures cause so much suffering. We're seeing that climate change is causing these extreme events to happen more frequently and making them much more severe. We really have no choice but to better prepare. Another challenge is that we are rapidly decarbonizing our energy system and integrating more renewable energy into the grid every year. We must keep this in mind, and we will talk about the current challenges of increasing grid resilience, while also talking about the opportunities that a cleaner energy system can offer and how we can accelerate renewable energy adoption in a way that keeps the system stable. And on that note, I would like to thank one of our panelists today, Ben Hertz-Shargel, for his contribution to this conversation in the latest issue brief from the Global Energy Center called Ensuring Energy Security in a Renewables World. You can find it on our website. So thank you, Ben. It's my pleasure to introduce this esteemed panel today. They are all experts on this topic that are going to be able to prepare to share with us perspectives from across the country. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome Rob Gramlich, the founder and president of Grid Strategies, Ben Hertz-Shargel, head of data science and demand management rhythm and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, Heather Rock, director of climate resilience at Pacific Gas and Electric Company, Bentina Chisholm-Terry, senior vice president of Metro Atlanta and corporate relations at Georgia Power Southern Company, and Michael Weber, Chief Science and Technology Officer of ENGIE and the Jose Centennial Professor in Energy Resources and Mechanical Engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. Before we begin, I would like to note that to the audience, if you would like to participate in our discussion today and ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. With that, I'd like to jump into the discussion. And I will start with you, Ben, because in your brief, you talk about the impact of extreme weather on supply and demand in the energy system. How did you see that play out in Texas last week?
Well, I think it fit a familiar pattern. We certainly saw the susceptibility of our generation fleet to extreme weather. It was really resources across the board, across technologies. Thermal generation suffered significantly. This is similar to what we saw recently in 2019 during the polar vortex there, as well as in 2014, as well as in Texas in 2011, which I'm sure we will speak about. We saw mechanical failures, instrumentation freezing, the lack of availability of natural gas, coal piles freezing in certain cases. So the thermal fleet is clearly susceptible to both cold weather as well as hot weather. Renewables, as was widely publicized, there were instances of wind turbines freezing and failing to catch wind, but it's just important to point out that wind can be weatherized at a modest cost. It operates today in the Arctic, so it's clearly not a fair weather resource. And solar actually performs better in cold weather than in hot weather, which is notable given how PV cells work. So part of this pattern is at the same time that supply is struggling, demand is soaring due to, in this case, heating loads. And notable in the case of Texas, Texas relies on its natural gas fleet, which is competing with as the fuel source of natural gas with heating loads. And so this is a reason that Texas really needs to rethink its kind of singular dependence on that fuel source, given this contention. And likely the level of demand seen was due in part to legacy heating technologies. Given that heating is not usually a concern in Texas, likely there were not a lot of energy efficient appliances such as heat pumps, which is a great technology for leveraging clean resources while acting energy efficiently. But the bottom line is that clearly ERCOT and suppliers did not see this coming. This is crystal clear in a market like ERCOT, where if you're a generator and you can provide in times of shortage, you reap a tremendous windfall. But if you're not, you not only don't make that money, but you are on the hook for significant losses. And the fact that generators were not prepared indicates they simply discounted the severity and the duration of the cold that they experienced. And the kind of final point I'll make on this is weather susceptibility is one of many reasons why regionalization is so important for energy markets. As many people discovered last week, Texas is largely not connected to the rest of the US grid, and for that reason was unable to import power when it needed it most. And ironically, portions of the state that are connected to other grids were able to import power, such as El Paso, and had a much more mild exposure to outages.
Thanks, Ben, for that overview. And there's a lot we're going to dive in and pick apart as we go through this conversation. And I'm certainly going to come back to you on that planning question. But before I come back to you, I'd like to turn it over to Michael, who is based in Austin. And we're glad you're here today with us and looking healthy and well. But let's focus in a little bit on the natural gas situation. We know that Texas is one of our most energy-rich states. So how did this happen in the natural gas supply chain?
It's really incredible. So Texas is the #3 natural gas producer in the world. Number 2 is Russia, and number 1 is the United States. So we're a big gas producer. We produce more than Iran or Canada or Qatar, and we had a gas shortage. And I think that's really a phenomenal realization we need to come to grips with. And the shortage happened for a couple of reasons. One is the demand was very high. The demand for gas for power plants, but also home heating, industrial use, LNG exports, all the reasons we use natural gas. The demand was quite high, but higher than normal. We set all sorts of records nationally and in the state of Texas for natural gas demand. But also the natural gas system struggled because, as you heard Ben say, we don't winterize the power plants. We don't winterize the natural gas system in Texas as well. Although you could, we produce natural gas in Canada and North Dakota and that kind of thing. But we didn't, and the gas system really struggled. The gas system struggled in 2 ways. One is gas production in Texas is often liquids rich. It comes out of the ground with a lot of water and other liquids, and those liquids can freeze. So we have what's called freeze offs at the well or in the oil liquid gas separator equipment or other pieces of equipment where the water crystallize and freeze. So a large amount of the supply was not available to the system because of the low temperature. That drops the pressure in the system. Unfortunately, thermodynamics says you can cause things to freeze if the temperature drops or if the pressure drops. So we had the temperature drop, we had freezes, and that caused the pressure to drop, and then the pressure drop actually made more freeze-offs happen as well. So we lost a lot of supply of gas from the wellheads. And in Texas, we have like a just-in-time gas system because we have so many gas wells. We have like a couple 100,000 gas wells. So we just pump it out of the ground when we need it. We don't tend to store it in caverns the way a lot of other regions of the world will. And that just-in-time system doesn't work if you start to have these freeze-offs happen. So that's one problem. Another problem is that part of the natural gas system is electrically operated with electric equipment and sensors and meters and valves and compressors and pumps and this kind of thing. And when we lost some power, we lost some of the power to the gas system, which created an even bigger gas supply cutoff. So you have the situation where the electricity system depends on gas and the gas system depends on electricity. And so a gas constraint became a power constraint, which became a bigger gas constraint, which became a bigger power constraint. So you have these cascading failures go through the system, including for the storage systems we have. We don't have that much gas storage, but we do have some gas storage. And we couldn't get the gas out of the ground fast enough from storage because a lot of it was electrically controlled. So this was part of the problem. And then we tripped a lot of gas offline. At the peak of the crisis, something like 48% of our power plant's capacity was not available. Some of that was the wind and solar, as you heard from Ben, not available, but most of it was the thermal capacity that had equipment derates, frozen equipment, things tripped offline. But a lot of that was the natural gas power plants that tripped offline, partly because of frozen equipment, but primarily because of the low pressure in the gas lines, because some of these modern gas turbines need higher pressure. And the older boilers or older turbines don't need as higher pressure. They could work with the lower pressure. So we had all sorts of pressure problems, supply problems, and frozen equipment. And this just made everything worse. And because we're a gas reliant grid, as you heard Ben say, 50% of our electricity is from gas, 20% from coal, 20% wind and solar, 10% nuclear. So like 80% thermal, 20% non-thermal. The gas system's half of it. That was a lot of capacity to lose. So that was part of the cascading failures.
Yeah, that was a great overview, and thank you for that. And I don't want to simplify this, and I don't want to go into the cost and the policy piece yet, but I just would like to ask. So what I'm hearing is weatherization. Is it as simple as weatherizing the system? If it was weatherized, do you think that that would be the answer to making sure this doesn't happen again?
It's one of the answers. So we can winterize gas, but we don't in Texas. And there are a couple of reasons. One is we started producing gas in Texas about 120 years ago. So we've been doing it for a long time. We tend to have an older, creakier gas infrastructure than other states where their gas systems and gas production are newer. So we have older pipes and pumps and valves and all that kind of stuff. And it tends to be above ground in this like spider web network of these rusty pipes or whatever. They're not all rusty, I'm not really being fair, but older pipes above ground that are not wrapped in insulation the way you would do in North Dakota. In North Dakota, you also might put it below ground if you can. And you in North Dakota would put your equipment in an equipment house. So the valves or pumps or the equipment would actually be in an enclosure that would protect it from the wind and the cold. We don't do those things in Texas. And we don't do it in Texas because it's older, but also because it tends to be hot most of the time. It's a semi-arid climate. It's not cold often enough to justify it. So we think, although the question is, if we build climate science into our planning, will it be cold enough often enough in the future to justify the cost? But so it's part of the simplification of we should winterize the gas system, but we could also winterize our homes. Our homes and buildings are designed to shed heat, not retain heat. We don't insulate for a 70 degree temperature degree differential. We insulate for a 30 or 40 degree differential, which means it's 110 out, you want to be 70 in the house, or it's 30 out, you want to be 70 in the house. We don't design to go from 0 to 70. So we have codes and efficiency we can do at our homes. We could also do the modern appliances, like Ben mentioned, we have older appliances. So if we had more efficiency and conservation and building codes, that would reduce the demand. And if we winterize, that would make the supply more robust. So we got to do both.
Thank you. That was great. I'm going to turn over to Rob now to talk more about the renewables, because I know wind was affected, but I'm also interested to know how they also might have increased the reliability of the system in some way. Yeah, Rob, what are your thoughts from the renewables perspective?
Sure. Well, thanks, Margaret. And I could listen to Michael all day, as everybody else is on Twitter and in the news. This is fascinating, but it's a horrible situation. And you just got to think about the people who are stuck there in the cold. It really is a whole system-wide energy failure. And of course, each region has its own system. And so I think we need to do a much better job planning and thinking about how these interconnected systems work together. All these, the more I learn about Texas and the gas system and how you can't get firm gas, as you can in, say, PJM, the Mid-Atlantic region, or, there's none of the gas units are dual fuel like they are in New York. You just realize that relying on that gas backup wasn't so good. But for renewables part, yeah, I mean, nobody building in Texas, I think, really thought you needed to put the cold weather packages on, as they obviously do in, Alaska and North Dakota and lots of other places. I mean, you can do this, and I expect probably going forward they will. There's a little bit of a opportunity cost. You lose a little bit of performance if you insulate them or put some of these things on that might hurt your summer performance. But, look, nobody wants to go through this again in the next winter situation. So I'm sure everybody will be looking at these opportunities to, de-ice wind turbines, just like we need to do up and down the gas supply chain. And whether that happens through state regulations, I think it could happen either through state or federal regulations in terms of standards. Or of course, you might just see the companies doing a lot of this on their own. But I do think we need a serious review to make sure it happens, to make sure the system is resilient next time around.
After this crisis last week, you heard a lot of people playing the blame game, and a lot of that blame was put on intermittent and so-called unreliable renewable energy. What would you have to say to people that have been pointing that out?
Well, it's clearly false. A few gigawatts of wind loss, or maybe about 10% of the total loss, is not the problem. If 10% is the problem, what's going on with the other 90%? I just do the math, do the numbers, look at what ERCOT numbers show. But look, at the end of the day, all generation can fail, and clouds can block solar panels, the wind can die down. We've seen the failure in the gas, nuclear, and coal. So that gets back to transmission, I think. What we've seen with other polar vortex incidents around other parts of the country is, when generation fails for whatever reason, whether you thought it ever might or just some completely random event happened, they end up shipping tens of gigawatts of power from the neighboring region. And, look, nationally, we didn't have a shortage of supply. And ERCOT's tie, the Texas ties, are only about 1% of the system. So, I think it's like 800 megawatts of import capability. So it's, the state chose to disconnect itself. Other regions are much better connected. And so I think we really need to work on transmission, inter-regional transmission as a resilience measure. Just when all else fails, you have that opportunity to ship power from the neighboring area.
Thanks so much, Rob, for that. And Bentina, I'd like to go to you and understand a little bit about how Southern Company prepares for low probability, high impact events like we're seeing in Texas, and kind of like we were talking about a little bit earlier. And given the similarities in a sense between Houston and Atlanta in terms of weather, climate, and public preparedness for extreme cold, what lessons have you learned from these events, or how had you already been thinking about this?
So, I mean, it goes without saying that we're deeply saddened by the tragic events that unfolded in Texas last week, and our thoughts are really with the people of Texas. And we remain hopeful that all the utilities will be fully and quickly restored. So, what we really saw, though, was the record conditions really overwhelmed the Texas power grid. And if Georgia experienced low single-digit temperatures, especially for a number of days, we likely would have some reliability issues. But I will say this, at Georgia Power and our parent Southern Company, we've extensively studied the impact of extreme weather events. And we have a planning process that makes sure we have a reserve margin study. And that reserve margin, which is one of the things that ERCOT didn't have as much of, represents the amount of resources needed above the forecasted peak demand to account for these types of uncertainties. So it kind of goes without saying, but I probably should say, except for the weather and the location, the conditions in Georgia and Texas are really very dissimilar from a utility standpoint in terms of how we're regulated, how we plan. All those things are very, very different. So as recently in Georgia Power's 2019 Integrated Resource Plan, and that's a plan we file with our Public Service Commission, that is our state regulator, we identified a significant increase in winter reliability risk. And there were 6 key drivers that led to that particular conversation. One was the narrowing of the difference between summer and winter weather normal peak load. So for a long time at Southern Company and all of our territories here in the South, we were a summer peaking utility. That means that we saw our peak loads during the summertime. We did not see peak loads during the wintertime. And that has a lot to do with how you plan your system based on when you experience your peak loads. But over the last few years, we've seen more winter peaks, and some of our utilities actually have transitioned to being winter peaking, or their winter peak and their summer peak are coincident, very, very close. The other thing we've seen is higher volatility of winter peak demands relative to summer peak demands. So our winter peak demands are more spiky than our summer peak demands, which tend to be ongoing. Again, another factor that influences how you build and maintain your system. We've seen more cold weather related unit outages at our plants, the penetration of solar resources, but as one of the speakers mentioned before me, solar resources, assuming that they're not covered with snow, and actually what we find is, of course, because they are dark, they absorb more snow, they absorb more sun, and they're actually hotter, and so any snow that falls on a solar facility actually melts fairly quickly. Our solar facilities outperform during the wintertime for a number of different factors. And then there's increased reliance on natural gas. And we've heard the speakers before me talk about the kind of the issues with natural gas, or what you need to consider with having a lot of natural gas generation and cold weather, and then market purchase availability, right? So that's part of what we've been talking about here. But those were the 6 factors that we looked at. And there was, as a result of that analysis, we increased our winter reserve margin in order to better prepare for the uncertainty. So what we knew, or what we know, is that we're going to have more reserve margin during these periods of uncertainty. And we're going to have more of these periods of uncertainty now in the winter. So let me take you back to, some of you may recall, and one of the other speakers mentioned it, the polar vortex winter event we had in January of 2014. And that significantly impacted the metro Atlanta area. And that's when the company learned a great deal about winter load and its very dynamic nature and impact on our system. So we did have gas units that experienced issues during the extreme low temperatures. And the company took those learnings already, just like we'll take what we can learn from Texas as well. We like to be a company that learns, and implemented weatherization efforts on our generating facilities based on those extreme low temperatures. And what we have is they're included in our fleet protection plan, fleet being the plant, and addresses all aspects of winter weather operations and is structured to prepare the company's generating plants and units for approaching weather, freezing, and sub-freezing temps. So we talked a little bit about that, but let me give you some practical examples about what that means. How do you winterize? Because I know that people hear us talking about that, but they're like, well, what do you do? What does that mean exactly? So it's proactive measures that are taken to protect the generating fleets from that freezing weather, such as installing permanent freeze protection enclosures, dedicating personnel to freeze protection coverage during periods of extreme cold, erecting temporary freeze protection closures and wind barriers in the advance of winter operations, and freeze protection preventive maintenance programs, and many more aspects. And so what that will do, of course, is help those particular assets operate more reliably and more efficiently during our winter months. So that's what we've learned already. And like I said, we'll continue to learn from what they've experienced in Texas to try to make our system as reliable as we can.
Thank you, Bentina, for that great overview. And with that, I'm going to turn to Heather. We're going to be talking about different weather extremes, because I don't think PG&E, I don't know how you're looking at the, I know that you dealt with the wildfire seasons and some load shedding events last summer. So I'm definitely interested to hear your lessons there and anything that might apply from what we've been seeing over the last week in Texas. Thank you for joining us.
Sure. So I'll just say, here in California, we are no strangers to climate hazards, right? Whether it's the increasing wildfire risk in our state, the extreme heat that we saw in last August heat wave event, we're seeing changing wind patterns, rain patterns, sea level rise. So we're sort of at the forefront of experiencing a lot of these impacts. And there are three lessons that I think we have learned in recent years. And the first is that our nation's critical infrastructure as a whole, and this is not just PG&E's utility system or California's system, but our critical infrastructure nationwide is a system that was designed to operate in the conditions of the past. And now we need to think of extreme weather conditions and chronic conditions too, like sea level rise, not as unprecedented, but as expected. And to tackle this, we have to use forward-looking data that are driven by climate models to understand how to redesign and to rebuild our system. So looking ahead, we shouldn't build to that heat storm that we experienced in August 2020. We need to think about, what does the heat storm of 2030 or the cold weather event of 2050 look like? And how do we design to that? The second lesson is that from a philosophical standpoint, running to failure is really no longer acceptable when the consequences of running to failure can have serious safety impacts on our customers, our employees, or the communities that we serve. When we can't provide power during an extreme heat wave or when it's 5 degrees outside, that has real consequences for people, and in particular, disadvantaged and vulnerable communities that have fewer resources and options for responding to weather conditions. So we have to rethink about the way that we operate this system and design it. And that third lesson is one about affordability. And I know that a lot of folks have been talking about that issue of, what did Texas prioritize with their low electricity rates? And I'd acknowledge keeping rates low is important, particularly for our disadvantaged or lower income folks who might live in hotter areas and they need energy for cooling, or they need energy for heating. But affordability can't be the only thing that we prioritize. A resilient system is one that's focused on the outcomes for our consumers and our communities. And we want to be able to keep the power on during an extreme event. And we have to be real and acknowledge that, that adapting to changing climate conditions is going to take funding, and probably a lot of it. And this leads to a lot of choices. How do we build an energy system, critical infrastructure writ large, that is resilient and affordable and cleaner and safer? And I think the Texas example shows us with pretty clear consequences that you can't prioritize one of those goals above any of the others.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that. And I would like to come back. I'm glad you talked about the cost and the trade-offs, and I definitely want to come back to that. But we are getting some questions from the audience, and I would like to pose this question, I think, to Ben, because we were going to discuss planning. We have a note from Stephen Green that says, please talk about the huge underestimation of demand, the lack of adequate generating reserves, and the policy decisions that allow retail providers to offer contracts that pass through volatile wholesale prices. So we've talked a little bit about how utilities and grid managers can anticipate and plan for peaks in demand. But what do you have to say to this, Ben?
So I was going to address this kind of in the broader kind of context of planning. Just broadly speaking, there are two tendencies that are important for system operators to fight against when doing grid planning and contingency analysis. And the first is, as was just spoken about, being backwards looking. And as we've seen the events of last week and in California, these were 1 in 35 year weather events. Clearly, global warming is accelerating the severity and the frequency of these kinds of events, and you can't be looking backwards in order to predict the future to the extent that we can. We need prospective models, and those are hard to build. The other tendency is to what I would call the independence mindset that we need to shed, where grid contingencies are often thought of as independent. So a typical example is what are called N-1 and N-2 kind of scenario analyses, where you simulate the largest asset in the fleet or a transmission line, and then the second largest one kind of going out simultaneously. And the notion is, if you are resilient to that, then you're good, because the chances of 3 simultaneous events is just exceedingly small. But as we've seen, weather is an incredibly correlating event that cause a vast number of assets to go offline. And so independence is something we need to shed. And I just want to make an analogy or to reference, this is the same kind of thinking that went into the 2008 crisis, where banks saw the loans underlying mortgage-backed securities as taking their risk as being independent, that they would default independently, when in fact we know that defaults are highly correlated based on market context. So again, it's important that we kind of have a very broad view of when we're looking at risk. So important for planning are weather stress tests. And this would inform to the kind of the question, the reserve margin needed. So how much spare capacity you need going into the season and into a given day. But maybe more importantly, what is the quality of those reserves that you're counting on? Because in the case of Texas, it wasn't the amount, it wasn't the reserve margin that was the problem. It was the fact that the unit that were online simply tripped because they were inequipped to deal with the cold. So you need to not only know you have enough resources, but you have resources that are bankable and that you can count on. It's important that this kind of stress tests be regulated. So for most markets, that's going to mean FERC. In Texas, it's a little bit different. It could be the Public Utility Commission. Kind of along the lines of this stress test, there needs to be an emergency response plan such that when load is shed, it's done in an orderly and in a prioritized way, so that, as was said a minute ago, the most vulnerable are impacted the least and the latest. There's a number of other kind of actions that operators should take. Michael, I think, said this before, making weatherization potentially a precondition for participation in markets. It hasn't been widely reported that ERCOT is the grid operator in Texas, that they require generators to both submit a plan and to attest that they have met a weatherization plan before each summer and winter season. The problem is that there was just no teeth in it. There weren't enough specifics of what constitutes a sufficient plan, and the consequences were just being reported to the PUC. If you have the requirement that in order you need to pass a more specific, rigorous test certified by the Public Utility Commission or or FERC in order to participate over the winter, that would get a lot of attention. Other things Michael mentioned about storing natural gas, which is critical. This is part of the standard playbook in New England, for instance, which has much more regular kind of prolonged winter spells. There are tricks there. It's tricky here in terms of incentivizing generators because it requires an upfront investment that isn't necessarily paid back from the real-time market or from the market at all. And so that is not something that ISO New England, for instance, has really solved, but it's something that would be of more use in Texas. Black start capacity, this is something that thankfully we didn't have to deal with, but this is the capability of certain generators to who are not dependent on the grid to start up. And Michael referred to kind of circular relationship between the gas infrastructure and the electric system in Texas, but having enough resources that can bring the grid back up if it goes down completely. And we were evidently not too far away from that. And it's not clear at all that Texas had the capacity to do that if the grid went down. And that would have been really catastrophic. We're talking potentially weeks of time before the grid would be back up. And kind of a final recommendation, this came from the joint FERC and NERC report analyzing Texas's 2011 winter storm, was that system operators should be committing more resources and earlier prior to extreme weather, in particular cold, in order to both kind of increase the number of options that you have, given the prevalence of generators tripping, but also because for cold weather, if you commit them earlier, they are more likely to be warm and maybe less susceptible to freezing as temperatures drop.
Thanks so much, Ben. And I'm actually going to give the opportunity to Michael to follow up on this. I want to shift a little bit to talking about some of these regulatory things that need to happen to prevent this. So let's start with that, Michael, and maybe you can also talk about Texas' unique situation, being that it's so isolated really from the other grids around it.
Yeah, so both those themes are very important. We have a weak regulatory structure. We make most of our investment decisions by market forces alone. ERCOT doesn't have the ability to require certain capacity reserves. It's sort of recommended reserves, and the reserves that ERCOT recommends are much smaller than you see in most other territories of the nation. So our recommended reserves are like 13.75%. Many other locations will have 20 to 30% reserves for their peak season. So we have lower reserves and they're not even required. And it's hard to force people to winterize either the gas supply system by the Railroad Commission or the power plants by ERCOT, but maybe the legislature could require the Public Utilities Commission or Railroad Commission to require people to winterize, but we don't do that kind of heavy-handed mandate very often. Things might be different now because this blackout happened in a legislative session. There's competing hearings, multiple hearings happening at the same time, investigations, maybe it'll change. So there's sort of a weak regulatory environment, leaving the market forces to do it. And the idea is that prices would go so high in a scarcity event if the power goes out and things like that, that it would encourage winterization. And that worked for some utilities, but not for all of them. And so this is sort of a question like, what are the policy options moving forward? Or as Governor Perry said recently, is just the price we want to pay. Like we have cheaper energy most of the time, and then we have these expensive events. And is that the trade-off we've done? So we'll see. I mean, I think it's cheaper and easier for everyone if we pay along the way rather than have a $50 billion surprise every once in a while. That's my view. And I think more people are coming around to that view as well. Another part of our regulatory environment isn't just the weakness of the regulatory environment, the market forces, it's the lack of climate planning. So this came up, I think Heather said this, right? We're building our infrastructure for 1970s weather. We should be building it for 2050 weather. That's a fundamental situation in Texas that we can't even talk about that. Like I get criticized just for saying, maybe we should build for future weather. So that is actually part of the regulatory scheme, is that we're not planning for future weather and not requiring that. That's part of it. And then we have this Texas frontier spirit, self-reliant, go it alone attitude with our independent grid. And by the way, our gas grid is not independent. We love to sell gas. We export gas and refined products and oil, and we export wood pellets. We love to export energy, but not electrons for some reason. We're different on that. And I've been arguing for about a decade, probably we should hook up to the other grids for two reasons. One is we can make a lot of really cheap wind and solar power in Texas, and we can pump those electrons into other states, help them decarbonize, make a handsome profit. And most of the time, like 99.9% of the time, and then 0.1% of the time when we need our neighbors to help us, we need to lean on them, we can. Right now, they can't help us and we can't help them. I think it would be good for reliability and economics and decarbonization with a grid hookup, but our isolated grid gives us the freedom to more quickly decarbonize our grid compared to other places. So our grid's becoming cleaner and cheaper than a lot of places, but it means we have these exposures to these risks. So that's hard to change. I don't think there's a lot of philosophical interest in connecting our grid to other grids. However, the economic interest could be pretty compelling because there's a lot of landowners that could make a lot of wind and solar. At some point, we're going to run out of room for wind and solar in the Texas grid. So we'll want to sell it to our customers. So that's the context. I'm getting a lot of calls from legislators saying, well, what are our policy options? And there aren't that many, other than things like mandates around winterization and the types of things that aren't very desirable in Texas from a policy perspective. However, we have a rainy day fund of like $10 billion, which we could call a freezing day fund or something and try to use for infrastructure. Maybe we can use some of the funds we've been saving for a long time to help kickstart some infrastructure investments, storage, microgrids, better technologies for smaller circuits to do rotating outages better, or winterization of the gas system or the power system. So that's my long way of saying our go it alone attitude and our limited regulatory construct actually hobbles us in some ways. It makes it easy to build in Texas, but makes it hard to plan for some of these more complex futures.
Understood. Thank you so much. And actually, I'm going to take a step back and turn this over to Rob to talk about maybe from the FERC perspective, talking about investigations. FERC also launched proceedings to investigate the threat of climate change to electricity reliability, looking again at the national scale. So Rob, what do you think FERC will do to improve resiliency and reliability of the system across the US? And what might DOE, how might DOE play a role?
Sure. Well, I want to pick up on what Ben said. These are all great comments, by the way, across the board. But I do commend Ben's paper for the Atlantic Council that you mentioned. I think it's in the chat there. Really good paper about clean energy. But his comments on planning for the future and the getting out of the independence mindset, and then referring back to the subprime mortgage meltdown, I think it was really right on. Hadn't actually thought about that, even though my father was the Federal Reserve governor who was screaming about trying to regulate subprime mortgages well before it happened. I wish I could say I had done that here. I'm not sure anybody foresaw this, but that future planning and independence are apt. Also, a third aspect of subprime that's relevant here is, as my father used to say, we're selling the most sophisticated financial products to the least sophisticated consumers. And if you think about these people you're reading about in the newspapers in Texas with a $10,000 bill over a week's period, I'm not sure all of those 29,000 or however many they were really knew what they were getting into. So I think we need to think about some regulations there too. This, the variable rate services. Now, look, if some are sophisticated and swear, take a blood oath that they know what they're doing, maybe that's one thing, or maybe large C&I customers can do that. But when you have all these people saying, "I had no idea this could ever happen," you really kind of wonder. So there's a third aspect, I think, there of a parallel between the subprime mortgage meltdown. So in terms of what to do, here again, and Ben used the word stress test. You remember Tim Geithner and the Fed was stress testing banks after the financial meltdown. That's exactly what I think DOE and FERC and NERC could do, is stress test each region and look at each region's particular set of resources and vulnerabilities, and do it prospectively based on just what Heather and others have said here about what the forward-looking threats are for that region. And I think that would be very, very helpful. It will also help, I think, highlight, just how to handle resource adequacy, which is done differently in each region, as well as how much inter-regional transmission is needed. There are, situations I'm sure that will pop out of such studies where you find inter-regional transmission needed. So I think in terms of what they will do, what I expect they will do, I think FERC and NERC will study it, and they'll probably identify things like winterization standards. They may or may not get into this sort of broader stress testing. I do think they both need to get past the old, just look at the reserve margin. Reserve margin is not really the thing anymore. That's not really the metric of reliability anymore. So hopefully they'll get beyond that. you know, the standards, whether the winterization and other types of standards are done at the state level, my guess is the state has every incentive to try to do it itself. But I do think NERC and FERC have the authority under Section 215 of the Federal Power Act to act on that everywhere, including Texas, even though the rest of the Texas system is not FERC jurisdictional.
Thank you. And on that question of cost and Bentina or Heather, I don't know if you want to talk about to what extent retail rates should vary, but I do want to get back to the question of how you're balancing the cost of improving grid resilience and integrating renewable energy while keeping prices low for your ratepayers. So I don't know which of you wants to start. Heather, you're nodding your head, but.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in on this, and you know, listening to Michael and thinking about, you know, how market forces and prices can motivate people to change. I think there's a clear economic and market argument to better designing our system, right? Because at the heart of this, if we can better design our system and get the best available data and assess what the conditions for our critical infrastructure will be over the entire life of that infrastructure, then planning smarter should translate into savings. So to give an example, if I have a transmission tower in the San Francisco Bay, and I know it's going to last 80 years, and I also know from the global climate models that sea level rise is going to happen near that tower, I should be planning the design of that transmission tower to account for the prospective flooding that will be affecting that tower over its full life. And if we do it right, that tower won't fail during an extreme storm event and flooding in the future, and then we aren't forced to repair it or replace it before the end of its useful life. And we could say the same, you can use this analogy across pretty much any sort of weather sensitive equipment. It could be those rusty pipelines in the Permian, or it could be your distribution overhead transformer in a really hot area. So making decisions like this will fundamentally save our customers and our shareholders money. I'll turn it over to Bettina if she wants to add.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit because it's really important that we remember the balance that we need for our customers, right? So we want their power to be reliable and affordable and clean. And I think someone mentioned before, anytime you take any one of those factors and you act like that's the only thing you consider, oftentimes we don't end up with the right result for the customer. And when we're looking at planning what we need, our business is a long-term capital intensive business. And generations in one point pay for assets that are going to be used 50 years from now, just like we were just talking about. And so you've got to make sure you have a system that allows for that planning and understands that planning. Everybody's interested in what they're going to pay today. But the reality is we've got to think about what it takes to pay for the system tomorrow, because it's that type of support that we really need. And so whether or not that's thinking more and more about energy efficiency, because, you know, the cheapest kilowatt is the kilowatt that no one has to use, whether or not that's continuing in the collaborative process of working with stakeholders on how you grow renewables as a part of your portfolio, whether or not you talk about the transition away from coal to other resources, you know, we can do all those things and we can keep rates affordable. At Georgia Power, for instance, our rates are 15% below the national average, right? But we've reduced CO2 by over 60% and we're planning for the future. We've got $7.5 billion that we plan to spend for grid investments for reliability over the next 10 years. And so we've got to really think about all these competing factors and figure out ultimately what's the best thing to do for the customer. I remember at Georgia Power, I keep in the back of my mind that 30% of our customers make less than $40,000 a year. And so what that really means is I have customers every day who are making decisions about whether or not they're going to pay their power bill or put gas in their car or anything else that they need to do, pay their rent or their mortgage if they have a home, all of that other kind of stuff. But I'm still responsible for providing them with reliable energy. And so I've got to balance the fact that they've got to be able to pay for it, but I've got to be able to build an infrastructure that's going to provide them with reliable power for years and years to come.
Thank you so much, Bentina. And you do keep keep reminding us that it really is about the people that are on the other end of this conversation. We've got a couple questions coming in about different renewable energy sources and also storage. And so I'd like maybe to start with you, Michael, about the potential for expanded geothermal in Texas. And then Bentina, I'll probably come back to you to ask about nuclear. And then Heather, I know California is really leading on distributed energy. So Michael, let's start with you.
That's great. And I'm glad you said geothermal, because when most people mention renewables, it's almost like synonymous with wind and solar, and they forget about bioenergy or hydro energy and geothermal. And I love wind and solar, and I'd like to see us build more wind and solar throughout the world and in Texas. But I think geothermal is one of those interesting opportunities, because in Texas, where we have about a fourth of the world's oil and gas wells, we punch so many holes in the ground in Texas, we tend to get oil, gas, and hot water, whether we wanted the heat or not. And we could use that heat either distributed geothermal or drill for heat on purpose. Like, what if we aimed for heat? Then we could do advanced geothermal. And there's some really good technologies under development with great backers like Bill Gates and others. So I think there's a real opportunity for a state with a heavy oil and gas presence to get some baseload power that we know from the experience of Iceland works in cold weather, and also can work in hot weather, as it has in California. California is really one of the world leaders in geothermal. So I think geothermal is a huge opportunity, and it has a lot of performance profiles that is complementary to wind and solar. I'd love to see more. It also solves some of the social justice issues around oil and gas industry, which employs a lot of people. And this is a great way to leverage that capability and keep that industry intact in a way that gets low carbon power. So I really like geothermal. I'd love to see more wind and solar. I think a lot of the problems we had with wind and solar over the last week or so in Texas is because we don't winterize, as you heard, but we know that works in other places around the world, so we can invest differently or just build more with geographic diversity. West Texas wind is different than Panhandle wind, which is different than South Texas coastal wind. And so have a little more geographic spread. It builds in its own hedge, which I would like. And then in Texas, we're unique because we have 9 nautical miles of ocean that we control. Most states only have 3. And this is part of the deal. When Texas joined the Union in 1845, we kept more of the ocean. So we could do offshore floating wind and solar more easily than most states. And that actually puts us closer to market and has different profiles yet again for wind and solar. So huge opportunities economically and environmentally and from a reliability perspective with renewables. And geothermal strikes me as the one that, at least in Texas, we really should have, could have tapped, and we haven't yet. Maybe that's the next big wave. We had a really big wind wave from, say, 2006 or so through now, and it's going to continue another 5 years or so. The solar wave is happening. We're about 2 years into it, so maybe we have another decade or two in solar. Why not have a geothermal wave just behind that?
Thank you. That was excellent. And we're definitely excited about geothermal at the Global Energy Center. We'd love to continue this conversation, but I'll move on to Bentina. And I know you talked a lot about how you're decarbonizing your grid, but I know in past conversations, we've talked a lot about nuclear. So maybe you could talk about the role that you see nuclear playing in this clean energy transition.
Yeah, so I think most people know that Georgia Power, along with our state partners, so most people think of this plant as a Georgia Power plant, but actually 40% of the plant is owned by Georgia Power, as with the other 2 nuclear plant sites that are in Georgia, and the other percentages are owned by public utilities in the state of Georgia. But we are building the first new nuclear units in 30 years on our Vogtle site. Vogtle's Unit 3 and 4. The in-service date for Unit 3 is November of this year, and for 4, it's November of next year. In Vogtle Unit 3, construction is about 98% complete, and the total project is about 89% complete. And they will provide our customers with a carbon-free energy source for the next 60 or 80 years, and of course, play a significant role in supporting Southern Company's goal of net zero by 2050. So we believe at Southern Company of all arrows in the quiver, right? So that includes nuclear, that includes clean coal as it can be perfected, that includes gas, and that includes, of course, many different renewables. And so by having all those different energy sources, we know that we can provide safe, clean, reliable, affordable energy to our customers. We're excited about Vogtle and glad to see it. We're also, like many other utilities, looking at that next generation of nuclear too, to try to see what does that look like and what's its viability so that we can continue to keep nuclear in the mix.
Thank you so much. And Heather, I don't know if you had a comment on this, on the diverse energy mix that you have in California, but I'm also interested in specifically the distributed energy resources like solar and storage. but you all might also want to comment on geothermal.
Yes, there's no shortage of diversity here in California, no shortage of innovation and a lot of great thinking about what does that future energy system look like. And I think we need an all of the above approach to finding increasingly cost effective and increasingly clean solutions to build energy resilience for our state and for the nation. And distributed energy resources are one technology solution to making our customers and our grid more resilient. But we also have to recognize that a lot of these technologies, like home solar and storage, are becoming more affordable, but they're still largely out of reach for most of our customers. So in the meantime, our large utilities like PG&E are going to need to continue to be that provider for communities that need our energy most. And going beyond distributed energy resources and renewable energy, I think we need to broaden the question to really expanding our thinking of what are all those exogenous conditions that we need to be thinking about when we're planning our energy system and planning our critical infrastructure. This includes new technologies, more integration of renewable energy, but also things like demographic changes and changes in consumer demand and changes in who needs energy and when. I think a couple great examples that I've seen over the last week is that Texas has seen this huge growth in people moving to the state, and was that change in demographic trends and increasing population accounted for in their load forecasting, maybe or maybe not. And so I think we need to think about these future changes to our system in different ways, and then if we can think about this and integrate it into our planning, ideally, we have a better planned and more resilient critical infrastructure and energy system.
Thank you so much. We only have a few minutes left, and with that, I'm going to come back to Ben and ask. We've talked a lot about the opportunities for renewable energy expansion. I love the examples that Michael gave in Texas and the opportunities there, but it also comes with some challenges, and that's kind of what you got to in your paper. So I'd love if you talk for a couple minutes, and then I'll give Rob the last word.
Sure, and I would actually love to follow up with some stuff that Heather was just saying on distributed energy resources. And maybe I'll focus on kind of renewables and kind of how advanced technologies can kind of come to play here. And I think in order to understand, we need to think about, so renewables have a significant economic impact on markets. They also have a significant operational impact. And on the operational side, you need to think about the different timescales that renewables have an impact. And you have, on the one hand, the kind of the minutes and hours time frame of cloud cover and kind of the diurnal patterns of supply. You have longer time frames where you can have larger weather patterns that can cause sustained deficits or surpluses of renewable energy. And then you have, kind of getting really into the technical minutia of grid management, kind of the second and sub-second time frame, which is really important. The grid today relies heavily on the inertia of large rotating magnets that live within conventional generators. And as renewables increase, the degree of inertia is going to substantially go down. And it's going to make the grid much more susceptible to fluctuations in both supply and demand, and harder to manage. And so given those timescales, different technologies have a role to play. We've talked about kind of diversification, about fuel sources and technologies, also kind of what resources can fit in to fill these gaps at different timescales. So if we're talking minutes and hours, flexible ramping capacity. This is the ability of certain generators to quickly change their set points based on signals from the grid operator. So think natural gas combined cycle units, but also energy storage, battery storage, hydro, as well as demand response. Over day-long periods or many days, which is something that we kind of could have used last week in Texas. You have this area that's become a hot topic called long duration storage. And it's widely believed that this will be significantly needed to accommodate renewables, given the kind of long-term deficits they may run during certain seasons. So hydrogen is an interesting possibility as a kind of storage technology for this, where you're basically producing hydrogen from renewables when there are surpluses, and then you're using it as a fuel in fuel cells or combustion when they run deficits. And a really important point is at this kind of second and sub-second level, where renewables can cause instabilities and where you need inertia. It's not widely known that renewables, while they're obviously limited in terms of their upper limits based on the sun and the wind and the tide and other sorts of whatever the source may be, although not in the case of geothermal, that they have near surgical control over their output at these kind of fine timescales. And so renewables can, in fact, along with technologies like stationary batteries, even EV batteries, can actually help mitigate the instabilities they themselves cause, which is, I think, really interesting. And I just want to second that I think flexible demand and price-sensitive demand, as well as distributed energy resources, have a huge role to play. There's an assumption that we need to deploy a tremendous amount of capital in order to accommodate renewables, basically deploying new flexible resources when we have, as Heather was saying, we have all kinds of consumer trends that are driving intelligence and what ultimately are energy assets into homes and businesses. This could be smart thermostats, it could be electric vehicles. And we can make those assets smarter, leverage the intelligence, which is cheaper to produce, and achieve the same goal as some costly rollout of infrastructure. Although I'll make a kind of important exception that transmission, as probably Rob knows best, is just absolutely critical in bringing on remote sources of renewables into population centers. So you need to make investments in transmission, but in terms of generation, I think we should think really hard about what distributed resources can do, and also flexible demand, maybe for another conversation, and plenty of challenges in kind of integrating these resources. I think California certainly leads the way in its integrated resource planning, but also FERC took an important step forward in their recent 2222 order to accommodate DER aggregations. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. And Rob, I did want to give you a chance to say something, and I think Bentina has one other interjection. So in our last few minutes, why don't we go to you, Rob, and then Bentina.
Sure. Well, I know we're running out of time, so just quickly, what Ben mostly described there was kind of moving power across time with flexible resources and storage, and then he said briefly at the end that we also need to move it across space with transmission. And so if you kind of think about what Michael described with wind in different parts of the state of Texas, where we've got resources across different time zones across all of the country, and two wind farms that are a few hundred miles apart usually almost have no output correlation. So the wind's always blowing somewhere, and if you integrate all these resources across space and move power back and forth, then you can make the whole system balanced. But to do that, you need a lot of regional and interregional transmission, and we can also do a lot with grid enhancing technologies to deliver more over the existing wires.
Thank you so much. And I know we could talk a lot more about transmission, so I appreciate you being brief, and we'll have to have a second session. But Bentina, I know you had one more comment to make, and then we'll wrap it up. Over to you.
Yeah, so I just was going to comment on the fact that we think of energy a lot of times like a commodity, right? It's traded and a bunch of stuff, and I get all that. But the reality is energy is a necessity. And for our customers, for our economy, for their homes, their businesses, our schools, all of that kind of stuff, it requires that we provide them with safe, reliable, affordable energy. And I just hope always in all of these discussions that we have, like this one, these that are heady and weighty and very intelligent and smart folks, that we're always thinking about that every day there are people who rely on our product in order to live their lives. And if we can always remember that, we can always do what we need to do for our customers.
Thank you so much, Bentina. That was such an important note to end on. And I know this was a timely discussion. It's an important discussion that we need to keep having until we really get to some of these solutions. So I want to really extend my thanks to each one of you of the panelists for joining us today. And please take care and as we work through these challenges together. To our audience, thank you for joining us as well. I hope you'll join us for our upcoming event next week. It's Advancing U.S. and Republic of Korea Cooperation on Nuclear Energy. It's on March 3rd at 6 p.m. Eastern. We are launching a new report and having a conversation about how the United States and Korea can leverage their shared interests in nuclear energy, research and development, and advanced technology to strengthen bilateral trade and exports to third-party countries. I'd like to also extend thanks to the people that helped put this event together, including Zach Strauss, Maria Castillo, and Zeynep Puernan. This discussion will be cached and available on the Atlantic Council website, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please share it with your colleagues. Thank you, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret.